So since Tangent had to lay off 400 people, everyone I know has been going through interviews to find new jobs, including my girlfriend. In the past 2 weeks alone, she's gone through 5 interviews with really big companies. I mean, really big. So naturally, she was really scared going into them. Wasn't sure what to expect, wasn't sure how to prepare for them, especially because she didn't have too much interviewing experience prior to this, because she landed her job and then she stayed there for a few years and, was at the same company before it went down. Since this is all fresh in our minds, we thought we'd make a video on all the key points we've noticed when interviewing big companies. Now, I'm gonna be saying animators a lot in this video, but really, I think this applies to all artists when being interviewed by companies. So if you're an artist and not an animator, I think this video will still help you. With all that, let's hop in. We'll start from the top and make our way all the way to the end. So starting out, the first things you generally need is a demo reel, a resume, and depending on what company you're applying for, a cover letter. So there are 3 main ways of applying for a job and landing an interview. One is just applying through their website. You find them, you apply through their website. Second is finding the recruiter of that company on LinkedIn, sending them a connection request, but then in your request, you type out the message of, hey, I'm interested in this position. I'm wondering if there's, that position available, and can I send you my reel? And third is being recommended to the studio by someone you know or someone that works there that you've connected with. This is where networking becomes really important. The more studios you worked at, the more connections you've made, the more communities you joined, events you've gone to. This is where it comes in handy, and this is where it can be really beneficial to network with other people in the community. Because usually when you get recommended, you kind of skip a few steps. Even though you skip steps, with all these methods, you end up at the interview point. You will always be interviewed. Unless your dad owns the business, you're gonna be interviewed. So a big misconception beginners have, and this is true for me, is that they think you're gonna be tested on your animation skill during an interview. No. In my case, I was studying the 12 principles of animation before my interview, thinking, oh no, they're gonna test me on this, they're gonna test me on that. That's not true. What they're gonna test you on is your personality to see if you're an asshole or if you can work with the team or not. They're testing of your personality, not your skill. But they will ask you questions about your shots. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can prepare for these kind of interviews a little bit later on in this video. So the interviewer usually consists of the recruiter and also an animation supervisor or director or some other CG person there as well. And the interview, from our experience, is usually pretty chill. So don't walk in there in like a full suit, full tuxedo, trying to impress them with like however you're dressing. But that being said, don't go walking in there in a onesie. So usually how the interview flows is that they ask you questions, and then near the end you ask them questions. Now the type of questions that they'll be asking you are, or could be, which shot was the most difficult in your reel? What was really challenging about your previous project? What was the quota like, or how much time did you spend on this shot? What would you say would be your strengths or weaknesses? What would you do differently? So this would be the perfect place to mention any faults that you think you see in your demo reel. You don't want them to think that you think you're perfect and there's no room for improvement. You want to show that you're willing to learn, you know that you don't know everything, and you're willing to admit that. And you're humble, you're not cocky. But that being said, don't go pointing out faults in your demo reel as they're watching it. Like, wait for a moment where the question comes up. It's like, hey, where do you think you could improve? Or what would you do differently? That's when you can actually go ahead and mention any faults that you see. You could say things like, oh, well, if I had more time on this shot, I would love to polish it. We had to do this, and so I had to sacrifice this and that. And so that I didn't get to add that to my shot, like something like that. That's the type of answer you could give. Obviously a little bit more fleshed out than that. But just remember, when you're answering these questions, don't be a red flag. Like, imagine what you're saying from their perspective. If what you're gonna say is gonna make them question your ability to complete the job, then that's a red flag for them. So don't do that. Try and think of it from their perspective. Don't seem incompetent to them. Don't seem cocky to them. Don't seem like an asshole to them. And you should be fine, because if you're at the interview stage, that means they already like your work and they just want to see if you're a right fit for the team. For bigger companies, usually there is 2 or more interviews. The first interview is usually with the recruiter, and the second interview is with the animation team. When you're talking to the recruiter, that's when you can mention the salary, the salary possibilities, benefits, work conditions, and whatnot. Or if you want to add certain conditions, like let's say you want to waive or you want to ask them to waive the probation period. That's something you discuss with the recruiter. Now, for the salary part of it, make sure you do some research. Do some research, ask around, and a lot of people are actually willing to share the salary if you just ask and explain your situation. There's a whole movement happening right now where most artists are sharing with each other how much they're making, and I think that's great. But figure out how much someone in your position, in your experience, should be making, and give them your expectation, but add a little bit to it, because chances are they're gonna bring it down when they come back at you, because it's a negotiation. The worst thing that could happen is they'll ask you if you're flexible with your salary or with your salary expectations, and then you can say, yeah, I'm flexible, even because you kind of overshot how much you're worth. I did say worst thing, but I had an experience here in Toronto that was a little bit worse when the recruiter asked my expectations for the salary, and I gave it to him, and he bellowed out into a laughter, smacking the table, and he spent the whole interview prior to that trying to belittle me, belittle my experience, and belittle my skills, just so he could lowball me when he came to the actual salary expectation question. Now, it's funny that he tried to lowball me because the name of the company rhymes with lowball. And if you're in Toronto, you know what company I'm talking about, and you know who I'm talking about. He's actually quite infamous for being that kind of character. So if you experience something like that, if that's the response you get, then pack your stuff and get the hell out of there, because that's not a company you want to work at. But when talking to the animation team, that's not really the place to talk about salary and that sort of stuff, because they're there to evaluate you for the team. That's the job. Their job isn't to dictate your salary, and that's not really up to them. They can make suggestions, but that's not really who you bring it up with. That's not what they're there for. So the kind of questions you can ask the animation team is about the project. What's the project like? What's the culture like at the company? What are their expectations of you? And if there are any sort of training that they offer when you first start. You can even ask how far along the project is, because if you're starting a project in the beginning, then it's going to be chill for a while, and you can kind of slow into it. But if you're starting on the project near the end, chances are you're going to be like dropped into overtime and dropped into just like working like crazy until the project finishes and the crunch is over. So it does make a difference when you start on a project, and that's a valid question to ask. Red flags. So throughout your interview, keep an ear out for red flags, because as much as they're interviewing you, you're interviewing them on to see if it's the project you want to work on, to see if it's a company you want to work at. When I mentioned my coworkers doing interviews, they're doing like 4, 5, 6 interviews, but they're choosing one, and that is a situation you could be in. So keep an ear out for red flags, so you know where you don't want to work. So when you ask about overtime, when you ask about OT, if the response is like, oh, well, we work as a team, and so if we need to, then we all work together and push that little extra bit, aka you're not gonna get paid for putting in overtime. We had a coworker who casually asked about the OT situation of the company. It's like, hey, so should I be expecting some overtime on this project? Which is a completely valid question to ask. And the company turns around and attacks her for asking that question. They're like, well, if you're not ready for overtime, then you're in the wrong field. I don't know why they were typing. It was an interview. But that's a red flag. That's not the question she was asking. She was expecting expectations. She was asking, should I expect overtime? Not, I can't handle overtime. I don't want to do overtime. Please tell me there's no overtime. So they were obviously very insecure about their OT situation. And the fact of the matter is, she was coming out of a year crunch. She was doing overtime for a year, so she could handle herself when it came to overtime. That wasn't the question. But if that's the kind of response you get from a company, you need to dip. That is not a company you want to work at. So if the company avoids that question, or even worse, attacks you back for asking that question, get the hell out of there. You don't want to work at that company. So lastly, let's say the interview went well, they liked you, you liked them, you liked the project, it was interesting, it was an engaging conversation between the two of you, or 3 or 4, or however. Once it's over, make sure to thank them for the time that they gave you, make sure to be very kind, and later that day, maybe even the day after, send them an email, a thank you email, again, for their time. Now, if you guys care about me, watch this little clip I'm gonna play, and I'll see you guys in the next video. If you weren't aware yet, we launched our website 2animate.ca. So if you're interested in an upcoming extensive Blender animation course that's aimed at beginner to intermediate level animators, providing you with everything you could possibly need to make a demo reel, you can head over to our site, sign up for a monthly newsletter where we share monthly progress updates on the course, as well as monthly animation tip infographics. So go ahead and sign up and be the first to access the early bird prices once the course actually comes out.